Welcome to the Sleepy Ancient Lives, a space where we will gently journey through the lives of great historical figures in a calm and soothing way. Imagine the murmur of the Nile beneath the moon. Feel the warm desert air brushing against your skin, and listen closely to the whisper of a name that never fades. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, a woman wrapped in mystery, in beauty, and in power. This is her story, and tonight it will also be the lullaby that carries you into rest. To travel toward her is to travel into a world that feels distant and yet still beats in our collective memory. A world of temples rising proudly toward the sky, of columns carved with hieroglyphs telling millennia-old stories, of markets scented with spices, flowers, and freshly baked bread, of wooden boats gliding their white sails gently across the sacred river. Egypt, the beating heart of a civilization that, for centuries, knew how to look at the stars and read in the course of the Nile the keys to life and death. It was in this setting that Cleopatra was born, a child who would soon discover that her life would not be like others, that she was destined to wear a crown heavier than the gold it was made of. Picture Alexandria in those times, a city bathed in the light of the Mediterranean, where Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and Romans lived together, a young city yet already legendary, founded by Alexander the Great barely 3 centuries earlier, with its great lighthouse, one of the wonders of the ancient world, shining like a nocturnal sun guiding sailors from miles away, and with its library, that dream of gathering all the knowledge of the world under one roof, in those streets where languages intertwined and cultures overlapped. Cleopatra was born and raised. She was not just any child. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of that Macedonian general who inherited Egypt after the death of Alexander. Her family spoke Greek, ruled with Egyptian symbols, and lived surrounded by intrigues and ambitions. From early on, Cleopatra breathed that dense air, where every smile could hide a betrayal, and every caress could conceal a poison. But she also breathed the air of the Nile, the stories of the nurses who lulled her with ancient songs, the temples that surrounded her and taught her that the pharaoh was not only a ruler but a being almost divine. As a child, she learned that words could be sharper than any sword, and that the sweetness of a gaze could bend the fate of an entire kingdom. When Cleopatra was a girl, Egypt was no longer that invincible empire of the pyramids. Time had passed, and Rome was rising as the new dominant force in the Mediterranean. The days of glory of Pharaoh Ramses were behind, yet Egypt remained a land of dreams, of mysteries, and of riches that awakened the greed of all. Its grain fields fed entire peoples. Its gold shone in temples and palaces. And the Nile, with its eternal cycle of floods, was like a god dictating the destiny of millions of men and women. Picture Cleopatra, only a few years old, walking through the marble corridors of the royal palace, hearing discussions among priests, generals, and advisors, watching from the balconies the port crowded with ships arriving from distant lands, and already sensing deep inside that one day all those eyes would turn toward her, that one day her voice would carry the weight of the final word. But before she was queen, Cleopatra was a child who listened to stories under the glow of oil lamps, who learned to read from papyri where scholars copied poems and treatises, who studied languages with Greek, Egyptian, and Hebrew masters, It is said she spoke up to 9 tongues, a rare gift in her family, accustomed to locking themselves within Greek. From an early age, Cleopatra did not only want to rule, she wanted to understand, and that desire for understanding was the seed of her charisma. Her footsteps echoed through hallways where the scent of lotus flowers mixed with the chants of religion. The temples taught her the power of ceremony. The markets, the value of closeness with the people. And politics, the art of patience. Each day, the girl became an apprentice to a complex world, and the world, without knowing it, was preparing to hear her name. Sometimes, beneath the starry sky, she would go out into the palace courtyards, and there, gazing at the moon reflected in the water of the pond, she dreamed. She dreamed of a strong Egypt, of a kingdom at peace. She dreamed of being more than a symbol, more than a figure adorned with jewels. She dreamed of holding in her hands the ability to decide, to create, to protect. And as she dreamed, destiny looked at her silently, as if it already knew that one day this child would defy kings and emperors. Cleopatra's childhood was neither innocent nor calm. She lived surrounded by family feuds, palace intrigues, and constant tensions. But amid that whirlwind, she learned to remain calm, to observe before speaking, to smile when she had to smile, and to remain silent when silence was stronger than any word. Thus Cleopatra grew. Amid the greatness of an Egypt that still shone with the glow of its temples and the shadow of a Rome drawing ever closer, with her feet on the golden sand of her homeland and her eyes on the horizon where the sea united peoples and cultures, that was the beginning of a life that, centuries later, would continue whispering in the memory of the world, because Cleopatra was not just a queen. She was an enigma, an eternal whisper that began in the laughter of a child, and that still today, when we speak her name, surrounds us like a nocturnal song. Time flowed gently, like the waters of the Nile that never ceased to move. The child, Cleopatra, began to transform into an adolescent. Her features sharpened, her gaze grew firmer, and her voice became an instrument capable of wrapping those who listened to her. In the palace, education was not a mere ornament. It was the key to survival. Cleopatra understood this early on. While other girls her age dreamed of jewels or banquets, she immersed herself in papyri, in conversations with teachers, in long hours of study. Her curiosity was insatiable. She learned philosophy from Greek sages, religion from Egyptian priests, mathematics from scribes who drew geometric figures on wax tablets. Every piece of knowledge was, for her, like a talisman, a shield against the whims of destiny. In the palace courtyards, she could often be seen with scrolls of papyrus. Sometimes, she would lose herself in poems that spoke of love and eternity. Other times, she drifted into tales of heroes who had changed history with their courage. Each word seemed to whisper that her life would not be ordinary, that she was destined to leave a mark deeper than the desert sands. As she grew, so did the tension within her family. The Ptolemies were not a peaceful dynasty. Brothers against brothers, fathers against sons, alliances broken and remade within days. It was a palace where poison could hide in a cup of wine, and betrayal could arrive from the closest hand. Cleopatra learned to smile gracefully at banquets, to observe discreetly in meetings, to read between the lines of what no one dared to say aloud. Her adolescence was marked by this double life, that of a young girl who dreamed of the stars, and that of a future queen who had to survive in an environment full of invisible dangers. In the palace gardens, under the perfume of jasmine, her thoughts soared. She wondered if she would ever truly reign, if she would be able to unite a divided Egypt and face the ever-growing shadow of Rome. For Rome was already there. Though the Egyptian people still worshipped their gods, though the palace still hosted lavish feasts, on the horizon echoed the steps of a power that knew no limits. Roman generals traded, negotiated, imposed conditions, and it became clearer each day that to keep the throne, Egypt would have to learn to live with that force. Cleopatra, still an adolescent, sensed it, and while others closed their eyes, she opened hers wider. It was not just her beauty that began to distinguish her. It was her quick intelligence, her ability to listen and understand, her gift of making each person feel that their voice mattered. That gift, more than any jewel or robe, was what began to shape her legend. It is often said that Cleopatra conquered with her gaze, but in truth, what she conquered with was her speech. Her tone was firm yet gentle, persuasive yet never harsh. Even as a teenager, she already had that rare ability to make advice sound like a gift and a command feel like an honor. On the nights of Alexandria, when the city glowed with torches and lamps, Cleopatra would sit on the high balconies of the palace. From there she watched the port, the ships, the merchants, the travelers arriving from distant corners of the world. She did not see only goods, she saw stories. Each ship was a bridge to different cultures, to worlds she longed to know and understand. Thus her adolescence passed, a time of learning, of observation, of quiet preparation. Destiny awaited, and Cleopatra stepped steadily along the path that would lead her to it. The Egypt she knew was slowly changing, and she, with the patience of the Nile, prepared herself for the moment when that entire world would rest upon her shoulders. Time in Alexandria passed like the warm wind blowing from the sea. The curious child and the observant adolescent were giving way to a young woman whose steps were firmer and whose gaze carried more clarity. Cleopatra was entering her youth, and with it, the threshold of power. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a man of changing moods. Loved by some, despised by others, he ruled with difficulty, always seeking Rome's support, aware that without that foreign power his throne hung by a thread. He was a king who spent lavishly, who sang and amused himself, yet who constantly feared losing his crown. From an early age, Cleopatra watched him closely. She did not judge him as a daughter. She studied him as an apprentice queen. She observed his successes and his failures, and silently gathered lessons that one day would serve her to survive. The corridors of the palace were a mosaic of voices, intrigues, and rumors. Brothers and sisters of Cleopatra grew around her, each with their own ambitions, each dreaming of power. The Ptolemaic dynasty was not a united family, but a silent battlefield. And Cleopatra, even as a young woman, learned to walk cautiously among those gazes that could turn into daggers. It is said that already in her youth, barely reaching adulthood, Cleopatra began to stand out. She was not just a princess adorned with jewels and gowns. She was a quick mind, While many of her siblings indulged in the pleasures of court, Cleopatra sought to understand the world. She approached philosophers, listened to merchants, questioned priests. Her thirst for knowledge gave her a different glow, a magnetism that was beginning to be recognized. Alexandria, with its bustling streets, was also her school. Sometimes she disguised herself, wrapped in simple robes, and walked among the people. She listened to the women selling fruit in the market, to the fishermen returning from the port, to the children running through the temples. She wanted to know how her people lived, what they needed, what they feared, what they hoped for. It was an unusual gesture in her family, accustomed to watching the people from balconies. But Cleopatra did not want to be a distant shadow. She wanted to be a nearby echo. At night, under the Egyptian sky, she reflected on all she had learned. Power was not just a golden throne. Power was listening, understanding, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. It was knowing what to give and what to deny. And in that silent dance of power, Cleopatra began to practice her first steps. Her father, increasingly dependent on Rome, taught her another great lesson: the fragility of the crown. Cleopatra saw how Roman consuls and generals demanded tributes, requested favors, imposed conditions. Egypt, proud and ancient, had to bow again and again to avoid being devoured by Roman expansion. This awakened in Cleopatra a mixture of fear and strategy. She understood that if she wanted to reign, she could not do so ignoring Rome. She would have to learn to deal with them, to negotiate, to seduce with words and agreements, to wield diplomacy as an invisible weapon. Meanwhile, in the palace, rivalry with her siblings grew ever sharper. There were banquets where glances were sharper than knives, conversations where every word was a test of loyalty, and nights when rumors of conspiracy echoed like distant drums. Cleopatra was not blind to this. Her smile was a veil that covered deep thoughts. Her silence was a refuge where decisions matured, and her gaze was the sign that she was no longer only a spectator. She was preparing to enter the game. Cleopatra's youth was a bridge between the dreams of the child and the responsibilities of the queen. Each step she took was like a seed falling into the desert sand. Some would be lost to the wind, but others would bloom in decisive moments. She knew it, even if she could not name it. She felt that history was watching her, that destiny breathed close to her neck. In the palace courtyards, with oil lamps softly burning, Cleopatra rehearsed conversations. She imagined herself queen, imagined responding to ambassadors, imagined negotiating with enemies. It was a silent game, an intimate exercise. But in that game, the woman who would one day face the entire world was being forged. Thus passed the years of her youth. Amid family intrigues, a divided Egypt, and a Rome ever more present, Cleopatra learned, waited, prepared, and though she did not yet wear the crown, she was already beginning to feel its invisible weight. A weight that would accompany her until the end of her days, and that would turn her into an immortal figure. Destiny, which until then had seemed to walk silently beside her, began to approach with firmer steps. Cleopatra was no longer just a curious young woman. The throne, though not yet fully resting upon her head, was beginning to cast its shadow over her. Her father, Ptolemy XII, needed allies. His reign was fragile, unsteady, always sustained by the strings Rome pulled from afar. Every decision of the king seemed to depend on the will of consuls and Roman generals, and Cleopatra, in the midst of this, became a privileged observer. She began accompanying her father to meetings, listening to conversations between ambassadors. Sometimes she did not speak, sometimes she only watched, but in her gaze there was sharp intelligence, a memory retaining every word, every gesture, every silence. Power is not always learned by wielding it. Often, it is learned by watching others wield it. And Cleopatra was learning quickly. At banquets, where the aromas of wine and spices mingled, the young princess listened to advisors debate alliances, taxes, conspiracies. Her face was serene, but her mind was a river in motion. She understood that ruling was a delicate art, like steering a ship over waters that could turn stormy at any instant. Meanwhile, the people looked at her father with suspicion. Many called him the Flute King, for he devoted himself more to music and pleasure than to governance. Others saw him as a weak monarch, too dependent on Rome. Cleopatra saw him differently. She saw in him not only his weaknesses, but also a mirror of what she must avoid. She understood that a kingdom could not be sustained on dependency or frivolity, that a ruler must be as firm as the stones of a temple, yet as flexible as the waters of the Nile. In those years, Cleopatra began to appear more and more as a visible figure. She was no longer only a daughter, no longer only a student. She was the potential heir to a wavering throne, and in her bearing, in her way of speaking, this awareness was evident. The people began to recognize her, to see her as more than just a palace princess. There was in her presence a serene magnetism, an air of promise that few could ignore. Rome, meanwhile, also turned its eyes on Egypt, not only for the grain that fed thousands of mouths, nor for the gold that shone in temples and statues. Rome looked at Egypt because it was the jewel of the Mediterranean. And among the reports and rumors that reached senators, the name Cleopatra began to appear as a different young woman, educated, with a brightness that could change the course of history. Cleopatra's nights at that time were long. She walked through the palace courtyards, breathing in the scent of jasmine lingering in the air. She wondered what it truly meant to rule. She did not want to be a mere ornament on a golden throne, nor for her power to depend on others. She wanted to be mistress of her destiny, her voice as strong as a river that never ceases. Sometimes, beneath the moon, she recalled the stories she had heard as a child, of pharaohs who built eternal temples, of queens who led their people in dark times, and she promised herself that, when her turn came, she would not be a fleeting shadow, she would be a name carried across the centuries. Destiny would not take long to test her. Her father, aware of the instability of his reign, sought to secure the continuity of his line. And it was then that Cleopatra began to be prepared not only as a daughter, but as a future queen. The training grew more intense, more real. No longer just lessons from teachers or games of imagination. It was life itself beginning to train her. Thus, the young woman who had walked among papyri, who had silently observed the games of power, who had dreamed beneath the moon of the Nile, began to feel how the crown slowly approached her brow. An invisible weight, yet more tangible each day, a weight that would accompany her until her final breath. Destiny, which for years had circled silently around Cleopatra, finally knocked at her door with the force of a flooding river. Ptolemy XII, her father, that fragile king so dependent on Rome, had reached the end of his reign. His death was not just the fall of a monarch, it was the beginning of a storm. And in the midst of that storm, Cleopatra rose, young yet prepared, ready to carry the weight she had felt approaching since childhood. According to the customs of her dynasty, the throne was not handed to a single hand. Cleopatra had to share it with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Still a boy, surrounded by ambitious advisors who saw in him the perfect puppet for their schemes. Thus began one of the most intense and dangerous stages of Cleopatra's life. Observing was no longer enough. Learning was no longer enough. Now she had to act, to fight for her place, to prove that her voice was not a whisper but a river impossible to stop. Cleopatra was barely 18 when she became Queen of Egypt. She was young, but her intelligence, her culture, and her magnetism made her shine as if she had lived many lives before. The temples recognized her as pharaoh, the priests pronounced her name in rituals, and the people looked at her with a mix of hope and expectation. But beside her, her younger brother and the regents who manipulated him became her greatest threat. The palace filled with intrigues thicker than ever. The corridors whispered names. The banquets hid conspiracies. There were those who claimed that a woman could not rule alone, that her role was secondary, that she should yield authority to the men around her. But Cleopatra was not willing to become a shadow. She knew the crown weighed as heavily as the stones of the pyramids, but she was ready to bear it. She always had been. In those first years of reign, she showed herself determined and close to the people. While her brother's advisors locked themselves in the palace, Cleopatra walked among the people. She visited temples, spoke with priests, listened to merchants. Her ability to speak several languages allowed her to reach different communities in Alexandria and beyond. Every word she spoke was a bridge connecting cultures, every gesture a reminder that the queen was present, attentive, willing to listen. The contrast with her brother was evident. Ptolemy XIII remained isolated, manipulated, a passive figure. Cleopatra, instead, radiated life, decision, and a magnetism that attracted both allies and enemies. And that difference began to ignite the spark of an inevitable conflict. The young king's advisors saw Cleopatra as a threat, a woman too strong, too wise, too beloved by the people. And in their ambition, they began weaving plans to remove her from the throne. Cleopatra, however, sensed it. She had grown up among intrigues. She had learned to read the hidden language of looks and silences. She knew that power was not a fixed throne, but a battlefield, to be defended day by day. Meanwhile, Egypt remained a coveted kingdom. Rome watched attentively, aware that Egyptian grain could feed or starve thousands of Romans. And Cleopatra, even amid internal tensions, began to realize that her greatest challenge would not only be against her brother, but against the relentless weight of a Rome that stretched its hands toward everything it touched. Thus, amid family intrigues, palace conspiracies, and Rome's shadow on the horizon, Cleopatra took her first steps as queen, a young queen, but with the firmness of one who knew her name must outlive time. A queen who, though surrounded by dangers, began to shine like the lotus blossoming in troubled waters, and as the palace became a chessboard where every piece moved with caution, Cleopatra understood that the true game was only just beginning. A game where intelligence would be her sharpest sword, and patience her strongest shield. The Palace of Alexandria, so often a stage for banquets, music, and light, began to darken with the shadows of discord. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII, eager to strip Cleopatra of power, pulled their strings with patience and cunning. They knew that the people saw in the young queen a different force, a promise of stability, a voice that resonated louder than that of the boy king, and that brightness unsettled them. Each day, Cleopatra felt the change in their gazes. Smiles that once were warm turned cold. Advice that once seemed sincere became disguised warnings. The air of the palace no longer smelled of incense. It smelled of betrayal. But Cleopatra did not allow herself to be intimidated. She continued to show serenity, walked with her head held high, and listened more than she spoke. She was aware that the battle had not yet erupted, but the storm was already forming above her head. Rumors spread like grass under the sun. They said Cleopatra wanted to rule alone, that she planned to push her brother aside, that her counsel was a threat to the kingdom's stability. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII used this story to poison the young king against her. He, still an adolescent, lacked the experience to distinguish truth from lies. He let himself be carried away, and little by little, the distance between the two siblings became an abyss. The people, however, felt differently. They saw in Cleopatra a queen close to them, someone who understood their needs and spoke in their tongue. Her ability to connect with them was a silent weapon her enemies feared. For while they hid behind palace walls, Cleopatra had won the hearts of those who filled the streets, the markets, the temples, and they knew that a ruler loved by the people is far more difficult to overthrow. The tension became unbearable. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII began to act with greater boldness. Cleopatra's decisions were blocked, her public appearances restricted, her voice erased from affairs of state, until finally, the young queen was pushed into exile. She was forced out of Alexandria, stripped of her place on the throne, and made to abandon the walls that had been her home since childhood. Picture that scene. Cleopatra, still with youth upon her face, leaving behind the city where her dreams were born. The port, with its ships and shouts, fading as she embarked toward the desert. The Egyptian sun lighting her eyes, which did not weep, for the queen, who would one day be remembered, did not allow herself to show weakness. She knew this was not the end, that the Nile always returns to its course, even if it must first bend, that her destiny could not be erased by decrees or conspiracies. In exile, Cleopatra did not sink into despair. She surrounded herself with loyal allies, with those who followed her convinced that she was the true strength of the throne. She began to gather support, to plan her return. Every word she spoke was an invisible thread weaving a web of trust and power. The young woman expelled was not a fallen queen, but a queen in waiting. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII and his advisors celebrated. They believed they had won. They believed that by pushing Cleopatra aside, they had secured control of the kingdom, but in truth, they had lit the spark that would soon draw a man who would change Cleopatra's life and the fate of Egypt forever. That man was Julius Caesar. Exile had not dimmed Cleopatra's light. On the contrary, it had made her shine even brighter. Her mind was a river that never stopped, always searching for paths, always planning how to reclaim the place she felt was hers. Meanwhile, Alexandria stirred. Rome had arrived in full force, and Julius Caesar, the most powerful man of the time, was in the city. He had come to Egypt in pursuit of his own war, chasing Pompey, and found a divided kingdom, two siblings at odds, and a throne in dispute. Cleopatra knew immediately this was her chance. If she could meet Caesar and win his favor, Egypt's destiny could tilt in her favor. It was a risk, but great destinies are written with risks. And Cleopatra, who from childhood had learned that power was a game of intelligence and audacity, was not about to let this moment slip away. The chronicles tell that she found the most ingenious way to present herself to him. She could not enter the palace through the main gates. Her enemies watched every move, ready to stop her. So Cleopatra chose the path of surprise. One night, she wrapped herself inside a great sack of cloth, as if she were a gift, and her loyal followers carried her discreetly to the chambers where Caesar rested. When the sack was opened, she appeared before him, not as a fugitive, not as a fallen queen, but as a woman who mastered the art of daring, of intelligence, and of charm. Picture that scene. The Roman general, weary of battles and betrayals, seeing before him a young woman with shining eyes wrapped in the mystery of the night. Cleopatra did not need many words. Her very presence spoke. Her gentle gestures, her calm voice, the confidence with which she carried herself. It was as if the Nile itself had appeared before Caesar, with all its strength and all its beauty. What happened in that first meeting is wrapped in legend. But one thing is certain: Cleopatra achieved what she sought. She captivated Caesar, not with a spell, not with artifice, but with the intelligence she radiated, with the serenity she exuded even in danger, with that gift of turning every word into a caress and every silence into a mystery. From that night on, her destiny and Caesar's became intertwined. Rome and Egypt ceased to be only two rival worlds. They became two forces united by a bond as political as it was personal. Cleopatra had not only regained an ally, she had regained her future. And so, the young queen, once expelled, returned to Alexandria not as a fugitive, but as the ally of the most powerful man in the world. An alliance that would soon ignite passions, awaken hatreds, and change the course of history. Cleopatra had achieved what once seemed impossible. She returned to Alexandria not as a fugitive, but as the ally of the most powerful man in Rome. And in her eyes shone again the certainty that destiny belonged to her. Julius Caesar, weary of wars and betrayals, found in the young queen something unexpected. It was not only beauty he saw in her. It was intelligence, it was magnetism, it was the confidence of someone who knew her name was written for eternity. And Cleopatra, in turn, understood that in Caesar she had not only a political ally, but a spirit with whom she could weave a deeper bond. The nights of Alexandria filled with conversations between them. She spoke to him of Egypt, of its temples, of the mysteries of the Nile. He spoke to her of Rome, of his battles, of the ambitions that divided the most powerful men. Two different worlds looked into each other's eyes and, little by little, recognized one another. As if the river and the sea had decided to meet in a single current. But their relationship was not only intimate, it was also political, and dangerously so. For Ptolemy XIII and his advisors would not accept that alliance without a fight. The city turned into a battlefield. The streets of Alexandria, once scented with spices and flowers, now filled with smoke and steel. The armies of the young king clashed with the forces of Caesar, while Cleopatra stood firm, convinced that this conflict would decide not only her life, but the fate of all Egypt. The port burned in flames, and amid the chaos, the legendary Library of Alexandria suffered wounds history would never forget. The knowledge of centuries mixed with the smoke of war, as if fire sought to erase what men had failed to protect. And Cleopatra, from the walls, watched with a steady heart. She knew that victory had a price, and that price could be as high as the sacrifice of her own history. Caesar, however, was an incomparable strategist. His troops, disciplined and fierce, began to tip the balance. The army of Ptolemy XIII weakened, and little by little, the city began to recognize who truly held the power. The young king was pushed into defeat, and Cleopatra, once expelled and humiliated, now rose as the victor. When the dust of war settled over the streets of Alexandria, Cleopatra sat once more upon the throne, not as a disputed princess, but as a restored queen, a sovereign who had proven that neither betrayal nor exile could erase her destiny. At her side, Julius Caesar, an ally, a lover, a bridge between Egypt and Rome. Their union was a scandal to some, a hope to others. But above all, it was proof that Cleopatra was not a passive piece in history. She was a player who knew how to move her cards with unmatched mastery. In the quiet nights that followed the war, when Alexandria once again smelled of jasmine and sea, Cleopatra and Caesar walked together through the palace courtyards. They were not only rulers, speaking of politics. They were two human beings, sharing dreams, fears, and hopes. And though the entire world seemed to watch them, in those moments they were simply two voices meeting under the Egyptian moon. Time, which had seemed to rush like a flooding river amid wars and conspiracies, suddenly grew more intimate, more quiet. Cleopatra was no longer only the queen who had reclaimed her throne, nor the ally of Julius Caesar. She was also a woman, carrying within her a new life, a life that would bind with invisible ties Egypt and Rome. When her son was born, whom she named Caesarion, the people received him as an omen of hope, a child who bore in his blood the strength of the Nile and the ambition of Rome, a child who seemed to announce a new era, a future where Egypt would not stand alone, but under the protection of the most powerful man in the world. Cleopatra held him in her arms beneath the Egyptian sun, and in her eyes shone a different kind of pride. It was not only the pride of a mother, but that of a queen who saw in this child the continuation of her line, the seed of a renewed kingdom. The birth of Caesarion strengthened her position as pharaoh, for in him there was not only tenderness, but also power. an heir who embodied both the tradition of the pharaohs and the legacy of Caesar, Alexandria filled with celebrations. The temples raised prayers, the streets pulsed with music and dances, and the people saw in this child a symbol of prosperity. For Cleopatra, however, he was much more than a symbol. He was the promise that her name would not die with her, that her story would continue beyond time. But in Rome, the news did not awaken the same joy. There, where laws were rigid and ambitions harder than marble, many saw in Caesarion a threat. An heir not born in Rome but in Egypt? A child who could claim the blood of Julius Caesar? That thought was like a spark falling upon dry fields. And Cleopatra knew it. She understood that, although for her Caesarion was love and future, for others he would be the cause of jealousy, intrigue, and conspiracy. Yet in her son's early years, Cleopatra allowed herself a measure of peace. She watched him grow in the palace courtyards, among gardens scented with jasmine, and fountains singing with the murmur of water. Sometimes she lifted him toward the sky and whispered that he was a child of the Nile, that the strength of the gods flowed in his veins. She was mother and queen at once, and in that duality she found a unique balance. For the people, the image of Cleopatra with her son was a powerful symbol. She was not only a distant ruler, she was a mother who walked among them with the same dignity with which she sat upon the throne. And that closeness made her even more beloved, even stronger, but destiny never sleeps. And while she caressed Caesarion's small hands, the echo of Rome still resounded on the horizon. An echo that would soon remind Cleopatra that power and love rarely walk without shadows. The echo of war had faded. Alexandria once again shone under the Egyptian sun, and Cleopatra showed herself to the people not only as a restored queen, but as a mother holding Caesarion in her arms. The child was carried into temples, blessed by priests as a son of the Nile, heir to the ancient tradition of the pharaohs. The people adored him, seeing in his birth the promise of a stronger Egypt, protected by the gods and shielded by Rome. But Rome was never a distant echo. Rome was a presence drawing closer each day. And with it came the figure of Julius Caesar, the man who had restored Cleopatra to her throne and who now shared with her far more than a political alliance. He was her lover, the father of her son, the shadow that made Egypt both protected and carefully watched. Cleopatra understood this with striking clarity. The bond with Caesar was like walking a narrow bridge. It offered her passage to greatness, yet a single misstep could bring her down. In Egypt, that bond was celebrated openly, but in Rome, it was cause for scandal. Senators whispered behind marble walls, and Caesar's enemies frowned in silence. How could the most powerful man in the world be captivated by a foreign queen, by a woman who ruled lands drenched in the golden light of the desert? It was then that Cleopatra made a daring choice. She traveled to Rome, bringing Caesarion with her. That journey was more than a physical voyage across the Mediterranean. It was a declaration, a symbol. The Queen of Egypt, with her infant son in her arms, entered the very city that governed the destiny of the known world. Her arrival sparked admiration, fascination, and envy in equal measure. Imagine the scene: the narrow streets of Rome crowded with citizens, pressing together to catch a glimpse of her. She appeared in silken robes, adorned with jewels that glittered like shards of the desert Sunday. Her bearing was serene, her steps deliberate, her gaze unwavering. She did not need to raise her voice. Her presence alone was enough to bring hush over the multitude. To many Romans, Cleopatra embodied an exotic dream. A queen who spoke many languages, who understood philosophy, who had the wit to stand among scholars and the courage to stand among rulers. And she had captivated Caesar himself. To others, she was a dangerous reminder, proof that Rome, proud and unyielding, could be swayed not only by armies, but by charm, intelligence, and a single woman's will. In the heart of Rome, Cleopatra was lodged in a villa near the Tiber River. There, among manicured gardens and white marble columns, she became a constant subject of conversation. Some admired her refinement, her eloquence, her ability to weave words into silk. Others saw in her a threat, a foreign influence that might bend Caesar's hand and twist Rome's future. But whether admired or feared, she was always watched. And that alone was a victory. Visibility was power. Caesarion, still an infant, was proudly presented as the son of Cleopatra and Caesar. But this stirred deep unease. Rome already had heirs. Rome already had laws. Could a child born on Egyptian soil claim a place in the Roman succession? The mere possibility was like a spark falling into dry grass, igniting disputes among senators, fueling rivalries, and planting seeds of conspiracy. Cleopatra, meanwhile, moved with calm precision. She spoke softly, always choosing her words with care. She walked with grace, aware that every gesture was observed and judged. She knew that a single misstep could echo louder than 100 triumphs. And yet, she refused to shrink back. In Rome, as in Egypt, she radiated the light of someone who understood her name was destined to outlast her lifetime. The days in Rome were not endless, but they were enough to leave their mark. She attended gatherings, dined beside Caesar, walked in gardens where marble statues stood in silence as if they too were listening. Everywhere she went, eyes followed. Everywhere she appeared, whispers rose. Some called her a fascination, others a scandal, but none could ignore her. When at last she returned to Egypt, she did so stronger than before. She carried with her not only the memory of Rome's marble streets, but the knowledge that her presence had unsettled the empire at its very heart. She had shown that she was not merely the queen of a distant land. She was a universal figure, admired, feared, discussed, remembered. Her name had crossed seas, and now it resonated not only on the banks of the Nile, but in the Senate halls of Rome itself. And beneath the stars of Alexandria, back among the perfumes of lotus and jasmine, Cleopatra understood one truth clearly. Her journey had only begun, and the world, both Egypt and Rome alike, would continue to echo her name. Rome, the city that never slept, stirred beneath the footsteps of thousands of citizens and the constant murmur of intrigue. Its streets echoed with military triumphs, with fiery speeches in the Senate, with conspiracies spun silently beneath marble columns. The air smelled of smoke and spices, the forums buzzed with restless voices, and the statues of the gods seemed to watch, unmoving, as men prepared their own tragedy. Cleopatra, who had once left her mark upon that city, was not there when it happened. But the news spread swiftly, relentless as wind across the Mediterranean, reaching Alexandria with devastating force. Julius Caesar, the man who had changed her destiny, had been assassinated. The one who had seemed invincible, who had conquered lands and hearts, fell beneath the daggers of his own senators. On the Ides of March, the Senate floor was stained with blood, and the entire world trembled at the fall of the most powerful man of his age. Rome's streets erupted in confusion. Some secretly celebrated the fall of the dictator. Others mourned the leader who had brought stability to a restless empire. The echo of his death was not a shout, but an earthquake felt across every corner of the Mediterranean. For Cleopatra, the news struck like lightning in the darkest night. Caesar was not only her political ally, he was the father of her child, the bond that tied Egypt to Rome. His death left an immense void, and that void filled quickly with uncertainty. What would become of Caesarion now? Would Rome recognize him as heir, or erase him from history as if he had never existed? The Egyptian people received the news with solemn silence. There was respect for Caesar, the foreigner who had restored their queen to her throne. But there was also fear, for with his death, Rome's protection slipped away like sand through open fingers. Cleopatra, however, refused to let despair take hold. She stood tall, lifted her head, and addressed her people with calm strength. She reminded them that Egypt was ancient, that its gods were eternal, that their kingdom had endured thousands of years of change and would endure once more. Yet in the privacy of her chambers, Cleopatra wept in silence. She remembered her conversations with Caesar, their walks through the gardens of Alexandria, the nights when they shared hopes and fears beneath the moon. The man was gone, but the bond remained alive in Caesarion. And in that child, Cleopatra found the strength to carry on. Rome, after Caesar's death, became a storm of ambition. The Senate divided, the people uncertain, the soldiers torn between loyalties. Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, stepped forward to claim his place. Mark Antony, his most trusted general, rose as a figure of immense influence. And between them, countless others with restless ambition waited for their chance. It was as if Rome had lost the axis that held it steady, and now it spun violently, searching for a new center of gravity. Cleopatra watched it all from afar, but she was no passive spectator. She understood that the game of power was far from over, and that Egypt could not remain isolated. She would have to choose carefully which Roman current to approach, for a single misstep could bring disaster upon her kingdom. In the quiet courtyards of her palace, Cleopatra gazed at the starry sky while holding Caesarion in her arms. Sometimes she spoke softly to him, as though he could understand, telling him that he carried the blood of two worlds, that his destiny was written in the waters of the Nile and the stones of Rome. She promised him protection. She promised she would fight for him, even if it meant standing against the empire itself. The death of Caesar was not the end of her story. It was, in truth, the beginning of a more complex chapter, one where Cleopatra would have to summon all her intelligence, all her cunning, and all her courage to survive. Rome could change, men could fall, but Egypt remained a beacon in the darkness. And she, carrying the weight of the crown and the memory of Caesar in her heart, prepared herself for the next move on history's grand chessboard. After the death of Julius Caesar, Rome became a silent battlefield. Octavian, young and ambitious, claimed his place as adopted heir. Mark Antony, a seasoned general, charismatic and beloved by the legions, rose as a powerful figure. The balance of power in Rome was as fragile as an oil lamp flickering in the wind. Cleopatra watched it all with caution. She knew Egypt could not remain isolated, that her kingdom depended on weaving careful alliances. And it was then that destiny placed her before Mark Antony. The chronicles say their meeting was in Tarsus, in Asia Minor. Mark Antony had summoned Cleopatra to demand answers. Why had Egypt not shown greater support to Rome during its internal wars? Many expected Cleopatra to arrive fearful, but she chose instead to appear as only a queen could, with majesty, with intelligence, and with charm. Picture the scene: a wide river reflecting the sunlight, and upon its waters a golden barge slowly advancing. Sails dyed purple fluttered like butterfly wings. The air was filled with perfume, flutes and harps played softly, and behind shimmering curtains appeared Cleopatra, reclining as though she were the goddess Isis herself. Mark Antony, accustomed to military campaigns, to the roughness of camps and the clash of battles, was left in awe. Before him was no mere subject, no simple foreign ally, but a queen who knew how to rule not only with swords, but with presence, with subtlety, with intelligence shining through every gesture. Their dialogue was more than political. Cleopatra spoke of Egypt, of its ancient history, its wealth, and its vulnerability before Rome. Mark Antony spoke of loyalty, of ambition, of his desire to hold together an empire that seemed to be breaking apart. But between the words, something else began to form: a silent magnetism, an attraction beyond diplomacy. Soon, what began as negotiation transformed into something far more intimate. Mark Antony found in Cleopatra a force unlike anything in Rome, a woman who could be strategist and muse at once, who listened and challenged him, who made him feel both soldier and man. And Cleopatra found in him a necessary ally, someone with the military power and charisma to support her ambitions and protect Egypt. Their relationship sparked rumors and criticism in both Rome and Alexandria. A Roman general bound to a foreign queen, a love entangled with politics, a bond capable of changing the fate of two nations. But Cleopatra feared no whispers. She had learned since childhood that power always comes wrapped in judgment and envy. And Mark Antony, captivated by her, soon followed her to Egypt. In Alexandria, together, they began an era of splendor. Banquets, celebrations, political alliances. The people saw them as a couple destined by the gods, as the rebirth of Isis and Osiris in human form. And though suspicion grew in Rome, in Egypt, Cleopatra shone brighter than ever, more confident than she had ever been. The queen who had once wept in silence for Caesar's death now found a new alliance, a new love, and a new path to secure her throne. But unknowingly, she was also taking her first steps toward the most dramatic ending of her life. Alexandria shone brighter than ever. The city, already famous for its lighthouse, its library, and its bustling harbor, seemed to breathe with renewed life under the reign of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The people looked upon them with fascination, as if they were a couple chosen by the gods. He, the Roman general, with a booming voice and a contagious laugh. She, the Egyptian queen, with a deep gaze and magnetic presence. Together they filled every corner of the palace and every street of the city with splendor. In the golden halls of the royal palace, the banquets became legendary. Endless tables covered with fruits, spices, and wines brought from distant lands. The air smelled of incense, fresh roses, and herbs steeped in crystal goblets. Musicians played flutes and harps, poets recited verses, and guests were left spellbound by the richness and refinement of Egypt. Cleopatra and Mark Antony did not host these feasts merely for pleasure. Each banquet was a political stage, a declaration of unity and power. There, amid the glow of oil lamps, alliances were forged, loyalties secured, and an invisible web was woven to keep Egypt strong before Rome. The people, seeing them together, felt reassured. They saw in Antony a powerful protector, and in Cleopatra a wise queen who had chosen her ally well. The stories whispered in the streets were filled with admiration. Together they were Isis and Osiris reborn, gods once again walking upon the earth. Yet amid the splendor, there were also moments of intimacy. Cleopatra walked with Antony through the palace gardens, surrounded by lotus ponds and cypress trees that whispered in the breeze. In those walks they spoke not only of politics, but of dreams, of fears, of the fragility of life, and the eternity of empires. They were two souls who had known war and loss, and in those moments they allowed themselves the illusion of refuge. Meanwhile, the city glittered at night like a cloak of stars fallen upon the earth. The lighthouse, always burning, seemed a symbol of their union, strong, luminous, capable of guiding all who approached Egypt. Cleopatra, seated on her throne, knew that this era of splendor was not merely a gift. It was also a truce, a breath before the storm. Rome never forgot, and in Rome the voices against her and against Mark Antony began to rise. Octavian, young yet calculating, watched from afar, weaving his own web of power. And yet, while intrigues grew in the distance, in Alexandria the queen and her ally reveled in an age of brilliance. It was the moment when Cleopatra reached her greatest height, not only as a woman, but as a sovereign, a queen who had survived exile and war, who had loved and lost, and who now, in the arms of a new ally, felt stronger than ever. The people celebrated her, the temples honored her, and Mark Antony admired her as though all the strength of the Nile resided within her. But history, patient and severe, waited for the moment to demand the price of so much splendor. While splendor bloomed in Alexandria, in Rome the shadows grew longer. Octavian, young yet cold and calculating, watched carefully everything that unfolded in Egypt. He knew the union of Mark Antony and Cleopatra was more than a love story. It was a political alliance that could challenge his own power. And in Rome, fear and ambition were the most fertile seeds. Rumors began to spread. They said Mark Antony was bewitched by a foreign queen, that he had abandoned his duty to Rome to indulge in feasts, music, and perfumes in Alexandria, that Cleopatra had ensnared him with magic, with sweet words, and promises of endless riches. Octavian, shrewd and relentless, fed these rumors. Before the Senate, he painted Cleopatra as a threat to Rome, an ambitious queen who not only sought to defend her kingdom, but also to expand it, with Mark Antony as her accomplice and ally. The words, repeated again and again, became truth in the ears of the Roman people. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Cleopatra and Antony enjoyed their days without ignoring the storm gathering on the horizon. They knew Rome would never accept their union without resistance. But they also knew that together they were stronger, and that Egypt offered resources, wealth, and strategy that could sustain Antony against Octavian. The celebrations in Alexandria became even more magnificent. It was as if Cleopatra wished to prove to the world that there was no fear in her heart. Processions of flowers, parades along the Nile, temples adorned with gold and fabrics. Each gesture was a silent challenge, a message that Egypt would not bow to Rome. Mark Antony, for his part, found in her not only love but inspiration. He said Cleopatra was the soul that gave him strength, that without her his battles had no meaning. And though his words were sincere, they were also dangerous. Each declaration fueled Octavian's anger, who waited for the perfect moment to strike. The tension grew like a tide, advancing slow yet unstoppable. Rome was divided, the Senate murmured, and the legions looked at their leaders unsure of whom to follow. History was preparing the stage for a confrontation that would be not only military, but also symbolic. Rome against Egypt, Octavian against Cleopatra, a clash of worlds and destinies. But in the nights of Alexandria, beneath the stars mirrored on the Nile, Cleopatra remained serene. She knew the storm would come, and still, she did not look away. For a queen who had survived betrayal and exile did not fear the shadows of the future. Within her, she carried the certainty that whatever might happen, her name would not be forgotten. Rome was a city of echoes. Every word, every rumor, every speech carried the power to spread like fire through dry grass. Octavian knew this, and he used it with mastery. If he wished to defeat Mark Antony and Cleopatra, he first had to convince Rome that they were a threat. Before the Senate and the people, Octavian began to paint a dark portrait of Cleopatra. He presented her as a foreign queen who had bewitched Mark Antony, a woman who had drawn him away from his Roman duties, wrapping him in feasts and luxuries, while the fate of the Republic hung by a thread. He claimed Cleopatra did not merely want to defend Egypt, but sought to rule Rome itself, and that Antony, blinded by passion, had handed her more power than she ever should have held. Octavian's words echoed through plazas, forums, and marketplaces. Fear began to grow. Citizens started to see Cleopatra not as a distant queen, but as a direct threat to Rome's glory. Whispers turned into anger, and anger into the call for war. From Alexandria, Antony tried to respond. He wrote letters, sent envoys, reminded Rome of his years of service and his military victories. But his words were drowned out in the noise. Octavian's propaganda was stronger, more constant, more calculated. In Egypt, Cleopatra remained calm. She knew Octavian despised her, that he wished to destroy her, yet she did not let fear paralyze her. She appeared strong before her people, organized ceremonies, reinforced the idea that Egypt was protected by the gods. She knew that if she showed weakness, her enemies would only grow bolder. Tensions escalated until war became inevitable. Octavian no longer spoke of Antony as a rival but as a traitor, and of Cleopatra as Rome's mortal enemy. The Senate, swayed by his cunning, declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. It was a calculated move. By focusing the war on her, Octavian achieved two things. He humiliated Antony, reducing him to the mere companion of a foreign queen. And he turned the conflict into a struggle between Rome and Egypt, between civilization and threat. Cleopatra understood what that decree meant. The die was cast, and the storm was coming. But she was not a queen who would flee. She knew her life, her son, and her kingdom were at stake. And with Antony at her side, she began preparing her armies, her ships, her strategies. On quiet nights, as the wind stirred the waters of the Nile, Cleopatra gazed at the horizon with a serene face. She was not naive. She knew a war of immense proportions was drawing near. And yet, in her eyes shone the certainty that she would fight until the end. For beyond defeat or victory, Cleopatra wished to make it clear that an Egyptian queen would never kneel before Rome without a fight. The air of Alexandria no longer smelled only of flowers and spices. There was a different weight to it, a tension felt in every street, every port, every soldier's gaze. Cleopatra and Mark Antony knew destiny was approaching, and that destiny bore a name. The battle that would decide whether Rome and Egypt could stand together or whether one would fall before the other. In the harbors, activity never ceased. Carpenters reinforced the hulls of ships, blacksmiths forged weapons, and soldiers trained from dawn until nightfall. The waters of the Nile reflected unfurled sails, ready oars. Entire fleets lined up like sleeping armies, waiting for a signal. It was a dance of preparation, a display of power meant to inspire confidence in allies and fear in enemies. Cleopatra oversaw every detail. She was no distant queen but a commander, walking the docks, speaking with generals, inquiring about provisions and sea routes. At her side, Mark Antony trained with his men, shared wine with them at day's end, and promised that all of Rome would remember their loyalty. Their union was not only romantic but military, and in those tense days, that duality was undeniable. In the temples, priests performed rituals. They burned incense, recited prayers, consulted omens in the stars. Oracles claimed destiny was already written in the heavens, that this battle would be remembered for generations. Cleopatra listened silently, with the serenity of one who knows the gods may guide, but in the end it is men who wield the weapons. The people lived between hope and fear. They watched troops march with pride, yet whispered in secret about the power of Rome, about Octavian's cold discipline and his formidable legions. Alexandria was a divided heart. It beat fiercely for its queen, yet trembled at the shadow of what was to come. In the privacy of the palace, Cleopatra and Antony shared moments of stillness, as if time itself wished to pause. They looked at each other with the certainty that they were bound not only by love, but by destiny. Within them was a mixture of confidence and dread. They knew they were about to play the final move, and that history itself would watch closely. The nights were the most intense. The sea wind blew, and from the palace terraces one could see the immensity of the horizon. Cleopatra often remained silent, her eyes fixed on the line where the sea blended with the sky. In those hours, she thought of Caesarion, of her son, of the future he deserved, of the legacy she wished to leave him. She knew she was fighting not only for herself, nor only for Antony, but for a millennia-old history that refused to die. And so, amid the clamor of preparations and the murmur of prayers, Egypt braced for the great clash. A battle that would be fought not only with armies, but with symbols. Octavian's cold, calculated power against the fiery passion of Cleopatra and Antony. The moon cast its light over the Nile, as if to preserve the memory of those days. The ships waited. The soldiers dreamed of glory or death, and Cleopatra, serene in the heart of the storm, prepared to face history itself. The dawn. The sea of Actium awoke in solemn silence. The sky, still painted in shadows, slowly brightened with shades of rose and gold, announcing the beginning of a day unlike any other. It was a dawn heavy with omens, as if history itself were holding its breath. In the camps along the shore, soldiers rose slowly, fastening their armor, tightening belts, checking the edge of their swords. Some murmured prayers to the gods, others kissed small amulets, while a few stared in silence toward the horizon. They knew this day would not pass like any other. It was the day when kingdoms, empires, and countless lives would be decided. On the decks of ships, sailors adjusted ropes, tightened oars, lifted sails. The murmur of waves mingled with the creak of wooden hulls under the weight of preparation. Everything was in place for battle, and yet an odd stillness prevailed, the stillness that always precedes the storm. The preparations. Cleopatra, aboard her flagship, gazed upon the sea with serene composure. She wore flowing robes of pale fabric, embroidered with threads of gold, shimmering gently in the morning light. She was not merely a queen. At that moment, she was a symbol. For her soldiers, she embodied Egypt itself, the Nile, the gods who had watched over them for millennia. Beside her, Mark Antony issued commands in a steady voice. He arranged the formations, spoke with his generals, reminded them all that they fought not only for Egypt but for the glory Rome had once promised. His presence was imposing, yet his eyes betrayed the tension of a man aware that destiny was about to be tested. Their fleet was magnificent. Over 200 ships, heavy and reinforced, adorned and ready to challenge Rome. But across the waters, Octavian's forces waited, with smaller, swifter vessels, disciplined legions, and a strategy forged in patience. The coming clash would not be one of numbers alone, but of wit, endurance, and fate. On the shore, priests lit sacred fires, lifting smoke that wound upward to the heavens. They burned incense, intoned prayers, read omens in the stars. They proclaimed that destiny was written above, and that this battle would be remembered for generations. Cleopatra listened quietly, with the calm of one who knew the gods might guide. But men must still raise the oars and swing the blades. The first clash. Trumpets sounded, and silence shattered. The ships began to move slowly, oars striking the water in unison, sails spread like great white wings cutting through the horizon. From afar, the two fleets looked like sea serpents, writhing as they drew closer, advancing toward the inevitable collision. The first impact was like thunder upon the sea. Wooden hulls smashed against each other, spears flew through the air, voices rose in cries that mixed with the roar of waves. It was violent, yet strangely rhythmic, each strike of an oar, each clash of timber, each shout forming part of a vast, chaotic symphony that spread across the waters of Actium. Cleopatra stood on her deck, not in fear, but with the composure of one who understood that a battle was also a ritual. She knew every choice in that moment. Every signal, every hesitation could alter history's course. Antony commanded his generals to hold formation, to block Octavian's smaller ships, to resist being encircled. But Octavian had planned patiently. He let the heavier Egyptian ships push forward, then sent his nimble vessels darting around them, cutting their movement like invisible nets in the water. The unexpected turn. Then came the moment no one had foreseen. From her deck, Cleopatra gave the order to unfurl sails and withdraw toward the open sea. Her fleet, obeying the signal, began to break away from the clash, turning from battle to retreat. Soldiers and sailors of Antony's forces froze in disbelief. Was it betrayal? A mistake? A hidden strategy? The sea, once filled with the thunder of combat, now carried confusion. Voices shouted across decks, commands, questions, cries of alarm. Mark Antony, seeing Cleopatra's sails depart, felt himself torn between duty and love. Octavian seized the moment. His ships pressed the advantage, circling Antony's forces, overwhelming them with speed and precision. The battle, once balanced, tilted rapidly toward Rome's side. Antony's decision. In that moment of chaos, Antony made the choice that sealed his fate. He abandoned the fight. Leaving behind his men, his generals, and the honor of Rome, he pursued Cleopatra. He boarded a smaller vessel and steered after her, drawn not by strategy, but by the bond of the heart. For many, that was the instant of defeat. Generals called it madness. Soldiers cried, betrayal. But for Antony, there was no alternative. His life was no longer in Rome. It was bound to Cleopatra, tied by an invisible cord, stronger than duty, stronger even than glory. The image of Antony abandoning the battle to follow Cleopatra became legend. It was the portrait of a love absolute, and the mark of an inevitable fall. The silence after. By dusk, the sea was littered with fragments of ships, planks drifting, bodies carried gently by the tide. The roar of combat had faded, leaving only the heavy silence of loss. In Rome, news spread like wildfire. Octavian had triumphed. Antony had fled with Cleopatra. And with that victory, the young heir tightened his grip on the future of the empire. Cleopatra's reflections. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra sat in silence within her chambers. She had survived, but survival tasted bitter. The temples still burned incense, prayers rose for protection, but the omens were clear. Rome would not rest until Egypt was subdued. In the solitude of night, Cleopatra thought of Caesarion, of the son who bore the blood of two worlds. She thought of her kingdom, of her people, of the ancient history she had sought to defend. And she understood that though the gods had carried her this far, the rest of the path would depend on her own resolve. The sea, which hours earlier had been a battlefield, now stretched calm beneath the moon. The waves touched the shore softly, as if to remind her that even the fiercest storms give way to stillness. Yet for Cleopatra, that stillness was only a prelude, a quiet before trials even greater. The collapse of Antony, Mark Antony was consumed like a flame flickering out. The man who had once been the terror of battlefields, the general who had drenched Rome in glory, was now lost in despair. He saw suspicion in the eyes of his soldiers. He heard the whispers calling him traitor. He felt the weight of a homeland that no longer claimed him. Nights passed without rest. He wandered palace corridors like a ghost, clinging to wine, to memories of past victories, to fleeting illusions that perhaps destiny could still change. But deep inside, he knew the truth. There was no turning back. Then came the fatal rumor that Cleopatra had died. Believing the lie, Antony felt his world collapse. If she no longer lived, what meaning remained for him? In desperate impulse, he chose to end his torment. Drawing his sword, he turned it upon himself, seeking release in its edge. Fate, cruel and deliberate, did not grant him immediate death. Wounded and fading, he was carried to Cleopatra. There, in her arms, he spent his last moments. She held him, silent tears falling, not as weakness, but as testimony of love. She whispered to him of eternity, promising they would meet again where neither Rome nor Octavian could follow. And so, Mark Antony's story ended not in triumph, but in the embrace of a queen who loved him beyond empires. Cleopatra's last days. With Antony gone, Cleopatra stood alone before the might of Rome. Octavian entered Alexandria with banners high, parading as a conqueror who had come to claim not only a kingdom, but also the symbol of its queen. The people watched in silence, resigned, their pride dimmed as Roman legions marched through their avenues. The city, once the brightest flame of the Mediterranean, now seemed like a weary creature, ready to surrender its strength. Cleopatra was summoned before Octavian. She entered the chamber with steady steps, dressed in robes that shimmered with jewels, adorned as though Egypt itself walked into the room. Octavian studied her with the cold gaze of one who no longer saw a sovereign, but a prize. He intended to carry her to Rome, parade her through the streets in chains, and humiliate her before the people as the ultimate proof of his victory. Cleopatra understood at once. If she accepted this fate, her name would be forever stained. The last pharaoh of Egypt would not be remembered as a queen, but as a captive. The final decision. In the privacy of her chambers, Cleopatra made her choice. She gathered her most loyal attendants, those who had never betrayed her, and confided her resolve. She would not live as a slave. She would die as a queen. She dressed in her finest gown, white with threads of gold and shimmering amethyst. Her hair was arranged with meticulous care, as though she were preparing not for death, but for a sacred rite. She lay upon a bed adorned with fresh flowers, the air thick with perfumes of myrrh and rose. She ordered a basket of figs to be brought before her. Hidden within was the asp, the serpent that history would immortalize. It is said she handled it calmly, allowed it to coil upon her arm, and welcomed its bite as though it were a divine seal. There were no screams, no panic, only a deep breath, a final gaze toward the horizon, and the venom coursing quietly through her veins. Her body softened, her breath slowed, becoming so faint it seemed to merge with the air itself. And in that moment, Cleopatra passed beyond the realm of the living into eternity. The poetic epilogue. Octavian entered her chambers soon after, expecting a captive queen. Instead, he found a sovereign lying lifeless, adorned like a goddess, serene as the Nile at twilight. There was no defeat in her face, only calm, the calm of one who chooses her own end, who knows power may take away kingdoms, but never dignity. Rome celebrated its triumph, but Egypt kept her memory. In songs, in stories, in whispers along the Nile, Cleopatra endured as the last great pharaoh, the woman who defied the might of empire and chose to die with pride. Time passed. Temples crumbled, the library burned, dynasties changed. But Cleopatra's name was never erased. Through centuries, she became myth, symbol of power, of love, of resistance. And even now, when the wind stirs the waters of the Nile beneath a full moon, it seems to carry an echo, the echo of a queen who refused slavery and chose eternity instead.